All right, my name is Rich Schmidt, here with Evan Bellingar at Bellingar Estate in Newburgh. It's February 9th, 2021. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
First question, as you know, why wine?
I'm one of those weird people that always, my entire life, wanted to get into grapes and wine. Growing up, I had a children's Bible, and there was photos of grapes and wine and vines, and I always liked those. I liked the photos of it, and always wanted to do that. So then as I got older, I had gardens, and I always wanted to grow things. And wine grape growing is so diverse, and a lot of folks will talk about that, but there's history, there's geology, there's soil science, there's topography and geography and all these things, and then there's the horticulture of growing the vine, and chemistry and the winemaking and the marketing sales, and all of these things add up to wine and the wine industry and the world of wine. And that to me is so interesting and diverse, because you're not niching down to something super narrow. It can be incredibly diverse. You can travel all over the world with this kind of secret language of wine and be able to be instantly conversant with folks, even sometimes without actually being able to be conversant with folks due to the language barriers. And so it's just deeply fascinating to me, and I love it.
So growing up, wanting to do it, tell me about what that meant to you in terms of education, childhood, and choosing what you were going to do kind of after high school.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wanted to make wine before I had ever tried wine, and we're not like a wine family, we're not an ag family. I'm from Northwest Washington, a town called Bellingham, and my dad was a structural steel guy and welder, and my mom ran a storage complex, so that's not how most Grand Cru things start. But I always knew I wanted to do it, and so ended up coming down to Oregon State to study horticulture, which had a very renowned horticulture program. But the horticulture program wasn't big, and it felt like it was me and a couple of professors with an interest in viticulture. So it was very, very, very interesting. Loved all the horticulture classes, the broad horticulture, and then taking a few classes on viticulture, and they ended up letting me out with a vitinology option, which in like 2006.
So that was kind of the early stages Oregon State was growing that part of the program. Tell me about those classes and about the professors.
It was really neat because the industry now is still fairly small, but it was smaller back then, and it was a lot of like one-on-one conversations with people like Barney Watson was one of our wine professors. I'm forgetting some of the other names, but Bernadine Strick was in horticulture and just taught these amazing classes. And I still get a huge amount of value out of that today, being able to identify plants and native plants, horticultural crops. There's so many amazing plants out there that you don't think about because you don't know about them. But then you see, oh my gosh, this lavender, this olive tree, these other things, it can come to make something really, really cool. So we're trying to do that a little bit here with lavenders planted underneath all the end pipes. We're going to do a cider apple block, and just want to have, and a formal garden, and we want to have more horticulture and blend the line of just a winery with kind of a farm stand, farm feel.
So from Oregon State, what was your next step?
Then I did a Oregon Wine History podcast. So as you and I were chatting a little bit, for some odd reason, I did an interview in '07, and so I wanted to give a blanket apology for anybody I offended or using too many curse words. But it was very interesting because I had only had a few years growing grapes then, and I should have been more humble, but that's not really my strong suit. And so in 2005, I worked with the great Scott Robbins at Woodhull, and still a friend, still a mentor to me, and still saw him this last fall picking up cider apples down at Lewis Brown Hort Farm. And so it's always wonderful to go back and visit. But in 2005, helped out at Woodhull Vineyard, which is Oregon State's vineyard. And then in 2006, it was my senior year. I was working 1 day a week up north here with Buddy Beck and Angel Martinez at Advanced Vineyard Systems, and the rest of the week going to school, probably, and then helping out still at Woodhull. So that was a busy last year, dating the beautiful Kim Bellinger. And so that was a lot, but it was really fun, and it was just a wonderful moment. And then I spent the next 5 years working with Buddy and Angel here in the North Willamette Valley. I remember getting introduced to Buddy by Scott because Buddy Beck and Scott Robbins had gone to, I think, graduate school together. And one of Buddy's challenges was nobody was coming out of schools, and anybody coming out of schools didn't want to go out and actually work out in the field. And so he was excited to hire me, and I was one of the few graduates. And so I remember Scott Robbins driving me up, and he was like, on our way back, he was like, you know, if you could work at a company like that, which to me at the time seemed huge, 250 managed acres, he's like, if you could do that, you could do anything. And it was a great opportunity to grow and do what I do now.
So tell me about that experience then of working with what you thought was a lot of acres at the time. How did you manage? How did you learn? What was the kind of day-to-day, week-to-week like for you?
It was certainly challenging, and when I started, I didn't speak a lick of Spanish, and so I'd taken a couple classes in college, and none of it stuck because I didn't speak Spanish on a daily basis. So I remember my first two Spanish words were buena suerte, which is good luck, and a guy named Enrique put me on a ditch witch, and he told me buena suerte, and I very embarrassingly ran it out of diesel later that day, like a total idiot. And so that was a really tough and interesting time because I was like cramming at night to learn Spanish, and it was a lot of hours I wasn't used to, but it was great. And that's how you learn how to do it. And managing multiple sites is just a different beast than one single site, and there's challenges and pros and cons to both, but I need to know not just what I'm seeing, but what am I not seeing. If I'm at this site seeing one thing, there's 10 other things happening, and I've heard it equated to like plate spinning, where there's plates spinning all around, and then you have to go to the one that's about to fall off, hit that again, and then keep everything going. So that's really a logistical and planning challenge that was a challenge, and it still is.
So at that point, there were not a lot of those kind of vineyard services around doing multiple site, multiple acreage. Tell me about your experience there and working with the different owners and the kind of different expectations, different demands while you're learning on the job.
Yeah, I would have to say it's really fun. It's kind of more a high octane, faster pace than you think of for agriculture, because it's very connected. There's a lot of cell phone calls, texts, emails, and things like that. And to me, it's really interesting. We're meeting people from all over the world. So it was a lot of folks, attorneys from Portland or doctors from Texas and things like that from all over the world have come to Oregon to plant a vineyard, and why they did that and what their goals are, and learning from them. A client of mine, he ended up being a developer, but in the Cold War he flew planes that would escort the planes that had nukes on them. And one time he was in a discussion with his general manager, and he was like, you know what? And they were kind of having an argument. He was like, I once had to escort nuclear weapons around planet Earth, and then we would have had to have dropped them, and I would have had to have lived with that. So sometimes when I tell you to do something, just do it. And he was a very nice guy, but it was like, oh, snap, yeah. It was very interesting, and you would never have met somebody like that, I think, in other industries. It just brings such a diverse set of folks to Oregon.
When someone hired AVS and your services, tell me about how the balance of what you could do and what you're expected to do, and the kind of standards being set by the owner versus what was kind of plausible on your end, and how you kind of made that balance work.
It's interesting. I won't answer the question, but I'll answer it in a different way. If you look at a vineyard, you can tell who designed it and who planted it. And even without looking at the age or the thickness, you can tell sometimes what the likely clones and things like that are, or the age and kind of the vintage. So Buddy Beck and Angel had a specific, type of end post, and they had a specific type of chain and a certain number of sets and things like that, and a particular spacing they like. For example, 7x5 at the time was their favorite, and they like to irrigate and things like that. So you can look at a vineyard and say 7x5, Pomard on RG with that end post. I bet that was Buddy and Angel, and more than likely you'd be right. And it's interesting, you look at Domaine Drouin, which is where Buddy and Angel learned a lot of their horticulture here. That was just a scaled down version of the same system. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting that we as vineyard managers can still leave our thumbprint a little mm-hmm. bit, because in a sense you don't want to leave a thumbprint, right? Our goal here, the clients, typically a client may be, at the time, I would say this is more common, like just somebody wanting to make the best wine possible. And that's still very much true, but there's also more corporate growers, that larger entities that are looking, for something specific, and they're looking for a yield to price ratio kind of thing, and which is still very valid. But it's interesting that you can still have an impact, because ideally we don't want to have too much of it, because we really want to find out what this hillside can do and produce and get the best out of it.
As you were learning, I'm curious what, and then to now, how do you judge a vineyard that you've not seen before? What is the first thing what do you look for out of a vineyard to judge the kind of characteristics about it?
That's a tough question, and I think almost everything is plantable, and sometimes folks will ask that, like, can we plant grapes here? And the answer is almost always yes, you can. But the question is what it's going to do. And so one thing I love about managing multiple sites is we get as close to anybody to like metadata for the industry. And so if we farm 5 sites on Laurelwood, we start to get a sense of what Laurelwood does. And then we can say, you know what, if I have another vineyard to plant to Laurelwood, I'm going to go with this spacing, or I'm going to do this instead. And you can kind of get those hints. And I think that's one of the advantages of obviously hiring a pro to do it, because this is all we do and talk about all day, every day, is plant vineyards and farming grapes. And so you get that advantage. And even like, say, when we're planting our vineyard here, we've got the lessons, and sometimes the tough lessons from previous generations that we can then put hopefully to good use and navigate a little bit closer to what we're going for.
So what was next for you after AVS?
So then in 2011, started with Results Partners, been there since. Very much enjoying my time there. We've been on a growth spurt, and it's different in a lot of great ways from when I started in 2011. And we've grown, and it's always, to me, always so interesting. I was in a vineyard this morning that it's a low elevation generally, but a lot of beautiful basalt rock there at the surface. And that's rare for that elevation. And so it's just interesting. And to me, it's very fun to find this out. We don't know necessarily what that part of the hillside will do, but if somebody buys it and we plant it and we make it into good wine and we keep it separate all the way through, we'll find out. It takes a lot of time because we don't get very many data points. Every other industry, you can A to B test and find something out very fast. In here, it's like, well, let's plant it, and 6 years we'll taste it, and then we'll decide if we made the right call or not.
What was your role at RP when you started, and how has it changed to now?
What was my role? Similar to what I do now, except as we've grown, we've kind of niched down. And so today I oversee an area like the Chehalem Mountains, part of Dundee, Yamhill, Carlton, and just in terms of production, and that's a lot to do and a lot to manage. And earlier when we were smaller, I had my hand in more development, site evaluations, as well as operations and management, things like that.
So you talked about a second ago about developing a site and how it's a long time until you're going to know how you did. Were there pitfalls for you in the early days? Did you make some choices you wish you hadn't? Whether it was have you mostly had kind of a pretty good idea where and how to plant grapes?
There's definitely, interestingly, so I was listening to my previous interview, and I say something at the age of 23, 24, and I was like, don't be a cheapskate and do a little bit of drain tiling when you should just drain tile the whole thing if you need it. And that really hit me, because when we planted our vineyard here, what did I do? I cheaped out. I only did a little bit of drain tile and did not do the real full-scale drain tiling. And as I was pruning my vineyard and it's soppy in one corner, I was like, dang it, I knew exactly what to do and I didn't do it. That's a great question, because if you only ever have one vineyard, you look at that vineyard map like it's the Bible and like it's the truth, right? But then if you're going to plant the vineyard next door, you're asking yourself, if I had this to do over again, what would I do different? And I think generally in the 15, 16 years I've been in this, we're tending towards wider spacings, because labor was tight when I started, and it's getting tighter for a lot of reasons. And so we want it to be mechanizable. The climate is helping us generally and getting warmer, so we can ripen more tons per acre and things like that generally. And so I think in these years we've gone a little bit wider. There are some clones that were very exciting as they came out, and then as we grow them, we're not as excited about. 943 is a classic example. If you are making it for your own wine, it's amazing. If it's going to your estate production, it yields so poorly, like it's very tough to make any money growing it as a farming enterprise. So things like that, something like Pinot Gris, the industry planted a lot of that, in the 90s to mid 2000s, and ever since then it's been a tough slog to make any money growing Pinot Gris, because at the time that was like Oregon's white, and that has not been true, and now Chardonnay is in this amazing renaissance. And so some of the things we're screwing up we won't know for a few years, and you're kind of making the best choice you can at the time and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're working with a lot of clients who don't necessarily have a background in viticulture, horticulture like you do. Part of the reason they're hiring you in the first place. Is it difficult to understand that level of patience, that level of like long term? Is it difficult for you to get across that like you can't just pivot on a dime in this industry and you have to kind of think long term?
Yeah, a lot of clients get it, I would say, but a lot of our clients, they got here by pushing the envelope, by pushing forward for action and things like that. And so sometimes they want to go a little bit too fast. And you can say, if say you're going to remove a vineyard that has phylloxera, you're better off letting it go fallow for a year or two or three or more. And sometimes that can just seem like a lot of time. And so clients oftentimes are in a hurry. And so you have to balance that and do education in terms of, hey, let's be very thoughtful about this. Mm-hmm. And then it's interesting, as you're developing a site, there's always that question of how far do we push down the hill, or here's a nice tree that we would love to keep. And some clients, will say, don't touch a single tree. And then other clients that are less concerned about that. And so it's this balance where I have an opinion, and there's kind of best practices, but then the client who's paying the bills has an opinion as well. And so finding a good compromise and balance between that is fun.
So what point of the process are you mentioned you're there for the production part of things, you're not doing the development anymore. So tell me, when you're brought in, when you come in, what's the general status of the vineyard? What's the general status of what you walk into?
Yeah, it's typically, and I'm not a stranger to it during the development process, but I'm not pointing with the client. So typically the vines are in the process of being planted, and it's our crews that are doing that and things like that. So within RP. And so I'm familiar with it, but it's just not something like I'm point on. And we do a lot, so it's specialization makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm.
You talked about labor and mechanization, two of the topics that come up in a lot of our interviews, of course. So I'm going to talk about mechanization first. Obviously, one of the things Oregon has always prided itself on is handheld wine, artisan wine. So tell me about how you've seen that shift and how mechanization is in the industry now, and maybe that's sort of the future for it.
Yeah, it was interesting. When I started at RP, we didn't have a single hedger, we didn't have a leafer, we didn't have a harvester, and now we have 5 harvesters and a great many leafers and a great many hedgers. And in some things, the machine does a better job. And like hedging, for example, you don't want to be doing this hand hedging for 10 hours a day in July. Not that much fun. The hedger rocks and rolls. With leafing, the machines, I feel, don't always do as good a job as like somebody there in intent could do on that. But because you don't have the people, you need to run through with the machine, open it up, get light and air and exposure to those clusters. Then you can come in, buys you a couple weeks to come in later and hand leaf pull. And harvest, historically, mechanical harvest has been viewed as less quality. And somebody told me something that really changed my mindset on it. Don't compare hand harvest with machine harvest. Compare hand harvest and destemming in the winery with field destemming. And if you think about that, okay, well, now the machine is going over and essentially field destemming, taking that berry off the rachis out in the field, and in some cases, with the machine harvest guys talk about like harvesting marbles, and you've got this bin that has a little bit of juice and a beautiful Pinot Noir berries, and they look like marbles, and they're very clean. You compare that to something that was hand harvested, sent through the December crusher in the winery, and they can look very similar. And so I think there's a lot of folks that are warming up to mechanical harvest, and I think it can make amazing wines.
And labor, obviously you mentioned an issue when you started, more of an issue now. Tell me how that has changed and what you think the sort of future for hand labor is here in Oregon.
Yeah, I think every year it seems worse than the last, and you say that every year and try to have like a surprised look on your face, right? And so it's always tighter. Oregon has a very high minimum wage compared to the nation, and it's been going up every July 1st, I believe, and that makes it tougher and more dynamic and higher pricing to find folks. But that in and itself isn't a bad thing, because we want people to make more money. And as long as everybody can make money along the way and keep doing it, it's great. Mm-hmm. But there are just fewer people. You know, it's very rare to find somebody born in the US who wants to work out in the field. I would be one of them, but I don't want to be brush pulling, every day for a month. But that's an important job. And I think pricing out in the field is going to go up. I think pricing to the end clients and winery is going to go up. And they're going to go up in lockstep. You look at other regions of the world, France, Australia, like everywhere else for that matter, how are they dealing with the same challenges? Mm-hmm. Global birth rates have been falling for a long time. Birth rates in Central America and Mexico have been falling for a long time. There's just fewer people. Mm-hmm. And how do we get smarter about it? Mm-hmm. And I think vineyard management companies have a responsibility to set up vineyards well where they can make amazing wine that you could handpick forever, and maybe it's justifies that. Or if 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the vineyard doesn't justify it, you need to be able and set up to machine picket, to machine hedge and leaf and things like that. Because if we don't, we're doing a great disservice to the person that owns that vineyard or the next person to own the vineyard. And I'm sure this has been very well covered, but the undocumented community in Oregon, and in fact the entire nation, it's really a travesty that has not really been, it's not part of the national discussion. Mm-hmm. And when you look at people that have been here for decades and helping build our state and our community and our wines, it's terrible to be in the situation we're in, and nobody talks about it, and it's terrible, and hopefully someday it'll change.
from your role in the industry, how do you manage it? How do you find labor? How do you keep labor? How do you promote labor? And how do you kind of protect labor?
Yeah, part of it is respect. And so something as simple as speaking Spanish to people who speak Spanish, like that matters and it counts, and it's a respect that I appreciate you and I'm learning the language that you speak, and you can of course communicate much better in that sense. Paying good wages and being able to attract the top talent to be able to continue farming vineyards. Designing a vineyard. So for example, when we planted this vineyard here at Warriors Rest, I knew I was going to be trying to do as much of the work as possible, and you need to think about that ergonomically. So our fruiting wire is significantly higher than we have in a lot of others, because I'm don't want to be bending down when I'm 20 years from now, 40 years from now. And so, and for harvest, it's just that much faster. And the crews here last year were really excited because they're like, oh, 3 tons per acre Chardonnay at chest height is so much better than 1 ton per acre Pinot Noir down 20 inches off the ground. And it helps the whole thing work. And those grapes are still going to generally taste the same because they're from this site, and that's the terroir coming out. And I don't want to say Oregon's not innovative, because I think Oregon is quite innovative as an industry, but the wine business historically oftentimes isn't innovative at all. It's like, well, why do you grow Pinot Noir? Well, the Romans brought it. Okay, cool. Then we've got that settled. And we have to break sometimes our mental molds about things like spacing, because that affects labor availability and the ability to mechanize. And we need to be looking at other regions of the world. How have they solved this? What have they found? And the more we can collaborate and innovate, I think the better. If we do everything exactly like we've always done, we're going to fail.
On that note, what are the innovations you've seen, changes you've seen in viticulture and vineyard practices, especially?
This is a little bit inside baseball, or a lot inside baseball, but things like cross arms. So my colleague Alex Cabrera and I went down to Napa 2 or 3 years ago, and everybody's got cross arms. And so, well, what's the deal with that? And then working with Ryan Collins at A to Z, he was a big fan of cross arms. So we have the great advantage at Results Partners or another management company, talk a client into it. Tell them the pros and cons, and here's where you could save money. So now we have several vineyards where we've installed cross arms that will mean we're moving wires less frequently during the season, so we can save labor in the summer and just make it more efficient to farm. We've been big on cross arms, and there's a great training system called Scott Henry, invented here in Oregon, and it looks a little bit unsightly, but it has a chance to almost double your yields. And I think for a lot of vineyard sites that have some higher vigor that they need to balance, it's a perfect choice, or some other way of getting more than just 2 canes out there. And so those things really move the needle if you're thinking about them, and if we're not too stuck in the way it's always been done.
When clients come to Results Partners, how would you describe the services you give? How would you describe your farming style, and how would you describe kind of what they're going to get out of it?
We hope to meet their needs as well. So if a client comes and wants the top end Pinot Noir, and they've got a great site for it, and they want assistance to do that, well, we can do that. Or if a corporate client comes in and they're looking at a large, lower elevation piece that really needs to kind of produce a lot of Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, we can do that as well. So we've got, I think, very nothing to be ashamed of in terms of our viticultural chops, our vit team, our development team, our operations team. We get shit done, and so but without being too myopic and just thinking about it as a farming enterprise. I remember a winemaker telling me once, he's like, Evan, this isn't the Oregon grape industry, this is the Oregon wine industry. And it's not just about growing more grapes better, it's about how do we end up with amazing wines at the end or economical wines at the end. And so that's our goal, is to reach our clients' goals in the best way possible.
You bring up a good point there you work with winemakers as well. So obviously a whole different part of the industry than just a vineyard client. So tell me about those relationships, building relationships with winemakers in the industry and meeting their needs while also meeting your own.
Yeah, I was very embarrassed in myself from my '07 interview, because it sounded very combative, like vineyard guys and winemakers don't get along, and that's just not been the case in the intervening years. And we're just two sides of the same coin, really. And we've got so many opportunities for collaboration, and I get a lot. I'm very blessed where I'm at. People like Brian Weil, Alexana, and John Gabelhausen, they invite me into the cellar, so I'm tasting the experiments we've done in the year. So we'll do an experiment in liquid liming, we'll do an experiment in leaf pulling, crop load, canopy height, and then at the end of the season we're tasting that, and that is really fun for me. I like drinking wine at work, getting paid, it's wonderful. But then I feel like that bit of innovation in a small way, you're pushing progress forward, even if it's in a small way. And I think vineyard managers and winemakers can very much be partners in that. And it's a very collaborative relationship. And harvest can get a little bit stressed, but clarity and well-worded, crisp emails work great. So crisp in a good way.
Crisp in a good way.
Yeah.
Tell me about harvest at a place with your size and scope of results partners. Obviously, harvest is happening at the same time roughly everywhere, all of your clients. So tell me about managing that time of year and how you do manage all of those needs.
Yeah, luckily it does not happen all at once. So the phenology tracks, so lower elevation and closer kind of to the center of the valley is warmer, and so that it blooms a little bit faster. And so one of the great advantages we have is we're picking a little bit earlier than the broad industry, so we can attract more pickers to go pick those early sites. We're picking sparkling wine, then that goes into Chardonnay, then it goes into Rosé, Pinot Noir, and then that really gets everybody excited. Pickers are making money with us, and then they'll stick with us as we move up the hill and to the west. Yeah, harvest. I have a few gray hairs from harvest, but that's okay.
How do you prioritize at that time of year then? How do you sort of make sure everyone is getting what they want?
First come, first serve on an email basis. And it's shocking, you would think there would be a lot of challenges of, I have to choose between winemakers, and that it has never happened in the time I've been at RP, because you just push it out far enough, and if a winemaker, and I've got several that do this, they'll say, hey, in 10 days I think I'll want to pick 10 tons on that day, and they've got it in the schedule. Perfect. Those winemakers leave satisfied 100% of the time because they're projecting ahead. Sometimes a winemaker will taste go sample and then say, oh my gosh, this is surprisingly sweet. I missed the window, can you pick tomorrow? That is, if we can, we will, but it's tougher to make that happen. We will if we can, but it's like, hey, I can't do it tomorrow as a first pick, I can do that tomorrow as a second pick. Okay, cool. Or, I don't want to be a second pick, let's go 3 days from now as a first pick. Perfect. And so the more we can communicate and the more we can plan ahead, we can kind of make everybody happy. With the exception of a few gray hairs. And then last year, of course, was very exciting with COVID and wildfires and things like that. Yeah, but we got it all done. It was pretty impressive.
I'm going to ask you about 2020 a little bit later. I'm very curious about your perspectives on 2020. But with the vineyards you've worked with for a while, the clients you've had for a while, tell me about the process of getting to know a vineyard for you, and how long it takes till you feel comfortable kind of knowing the space, and how that kind of impacts what you do there, or what you recommend or suggest there.
Yeah, there's limits to it, but you can really read a vine. So say this is in February, you can really see how those vines grew, and when you're pruning, you can say, okay, last year 12 canes were left and they all grew about how we would like, then that was a good choice. Let's prune it down to 12 buds next year. Or it was left with 12 buds last year and the shoots didn't make it up to the top of the canopy. We need to now leave less. Or they left too few buds and the ones that remained turned into these big honking thick bull canes. And it's like, okay, then you need to kind of change that. So that's kind of the dormant season side. During the growing season, conformity sounds like a bad word, but you want it to be consistent. You don't want to like pick one block 4 different times because this part's stressy and this part's not. So your goal is to get it somewhat consistent within that block. And then as you're walking a site in the season, you're looking at, okay, are these leaves warm? Are they cool? Are they transpiring and breathing and sweating and things like that? And are they happy and healthy? And then just trying to maintain that. And then as you're looking forward, you're saying, okay, should I put more cover crop in to try to tame these guys down? Should I cultivate that out to take away the competition to really boost these guys? Does this need some amount of fertilizer? Does it need lime? Does it need a specific nutrient? And then we'll test for that and things like that. And then ultimately, it's really, what does it taste like as finished wine? So the more you can have a vineyard taken all the way through the process without getting blended, the more then years later you'll be able to say, oh, this is what a shade tastes like from that year, and how it develops, and see, okay, what is that site, and what is the winemaking, or what's the region?
Have you one of the things Kim mentioned in her interview that we'll talk about a little bit later is about the site here and about kind of your decisions you've made here. And you talked earlier in the interview about
terrible vineyard.
C+, but at the best. You talked earlier about how different clients have different ideas with things other than vines on their property, with trees or versus. I'm curious, has that changed? Have you seen what a kind of an ideal vineyard looks like change in people's minds, or is that still roughly kind of a model in people's heads of what a vineyard should be?
I think my ideal vineyard has some other thing. And you look at the old world, old Europe, a lot of them are diversified farms where there's vineyards and something else, and animal agriculture or something. And as much as I do think vineyards are here to stay, and I think we're going to be growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay here for many, many decades, I like the diversification of something else. We have some bungalows on the property that we can rent out and have that kind of agriturismo tourism aspect. And we want to have cider apples, and monoculture is just one thing. And economically, it's concentration risk. So I like the idea of something more, but if you've got expensive land on, Jory soils, you don't want to, put a hazelnut tree on there because it might make amazing Pinot Noir and hazelnuts. So it's hard to justify spending a premium price to have land that is not being used for vineyards. But also a lot of parcels have lower land, maybe a frost pocket that would do great with another crop, grazing. I think there's other things, what the folks at Durant are doing with olives, and I don't know if they're doing lavender commercially, but it's beautiful, and I think it helps. And I think from the tourism perspective, it's so interesting because it's not like, oh, here's my Pinot Noir. Okay, here's my Pinot Noir, here's our Chardonnay that we grow, and here's, estate grown chickens, and here's cider, and here's nuts, and here's all these things and here's here for us, here's quilts that Kim made, and that fabric of what we're doing all comes together, and it's not just one thing.
So you and people who work at RP and similar organizations have a kind of a unique perspective of the different AVAs and working at different sub-AVAs. Tell me, as that has proliferated, and now we have so many sub-AVAs, what are the noticeable differences for you, and is it justified to have as many sub-AVAs as we do?
I remember being young and thinking we're over balkanizing, right? And I think I was definitely wrong on that, because now that we know these areas are different, there's a benefit to delineating that. And I think Oregon's done a good job of not going too much too fast, and there's other wine growing regions where the AVA is kind of like there's overlap and things like that, and it can be confusing. I think I think for a national market, you don't have to talk about, hey, I'm in, you know, the Chehalem Mountains. You can just be like, hey, this is a Willamette Valley Oregon Pinot Noir. And at some point you can be like, this is an Oregon Pinot Noir. But for the people who really care, I think it does matter, and it is interesting. And so I think I got paid back by God, because the boundary for the Chehalem Mountains is like 50 feet on the other side of this property boundary, even though we make the elevation. And so that was payback for clucking my tongue at like of cutting up too many AVAs. But I would say it's very good to grow grapes in the region a lot and for a long time, and then turn around and divide it out. So that way you kind of know what you're dividing and subdividing.
Do the different AVAs bring different challenges for you?
Yes. To paint with too broad a brush, you look at Ribbon Ridge, and those soils are not robust from an agricultural perspective. They're uplift marine sediments, they're kind of droughty, and that makes amazing wines. But if your goal was to produce a lot of wine to go into a $25 Pinot Noir, that would not be a good AVA for you. It's a great AVA for high-end Pinot Noir. There's parts of other AVAs where the opposite is true. Like, okay, you know, thicker soils of this part of a different area can be very productive. Or, you know, hey, you got to watch out for elevation in the Oleander Hills, because there might be some great sites that might be a little bit too high to consistently ripen. So it's interesting, and it's fun to be working in the business to see that, because I feel like if I was in an estate operation, I would know that estate very well, but not what's happening around the AVAs.
Well, let's talk about your estate. Kim mentioned this was something you always had in mind. You always had the idea of having your own space, your own wine. So tell me about this space, why you chose it, and about kind of building the vineyard and building the beginnings of Bellingar Estate.
Yeah, we had watched this property for something like 4 or 5 years on Zillow, because it had been listed for a really long time. And very much an aspirational kind of thing, or like the way you look at expensive housing, like, oh, that'd be nice. But this property is 16 and a half acres, has a main house, has a bunch of outbuildings, had 2 duplexes on it, and 12 acres of old hazelnuts. Like, for us, that was just beyond perfect. And it was not beyond perfect for all the people that passed on it for all those years that it was for sale. And so we just looked at it and just like, oh man, that'd be neat. And then as we did better with some of our other real estate stuff, then it seemed like maybe it's a possibility. And so then in 2016, we were able to close on the property and bought it from an amazing woman, Adelina Slocum. And Kim may have told you some of those stories, but I just get a kick out of you know, her being the guard when her dad was making wine in Prohibition, and she would be down at the road, and if anybody drove by or walked by, she'd run up and tell them to hide the wine. And her dad had bought this property with his discharge pay from World War I, and hence why we call it Warrior's Rest, to honor him, a fellow named Louis Dare, and Adelina's dad. And he had cleared trees and planted his dreams. He'd planted a couple rows of grapes because he was a good Italian immigrant, and he made his own wine here. So I feel very much I feel a connection to this property, to this land, and to the family we purchased it from, because I feel like it's the same dream of making a go here in Oregon.
So tell me about taking it over in the state it was and turning it into what it is now, especially from the vineyard side. What did you envision for a vineyard here, and what were you, with all the lessons you've learned, all the vineyards you've seen, how did you decide what to do here?
It's infinitely easier for a client vineyard to be decisive and be like, you know what, you should do this and this and this. And then for me, it was like, oh my gosh, now this is expensive. You know, it's not expensive when they do it; it's expensive when I do it. And we are not .com millionaires, and so we had to do things sequentially. We bid off things when we could, and this site is lower elevation. It's about 250 feet, and we've noticed as we've been coming down the hills, we have vineyards that they tend to be a little bit earlier ripening the farther you come down the hill, and they tend to be a bit more productive. And so sometimes that's not desirable, but for the wines we want to make, which is we want them rich, we want them approachable, and we want them ready for you to enjoy daily and weekly, that is just perfect. And so we chose a little bit wider spacing because these are thick soils. We need the space to be able to balance out the vigor. We are going to be set up for that Scott Henry system to potentially have decent yields if the vines can handle it and when they can handle it. And I kind of wanted to do a model vineyard of if I was going to do it, this is how I would do it. And now this is my chance. And so the trellis is set up bulletproof for mechanical harvest, 8x5, so a bit wider spacing, and kind of doing some innovative things on, and super inside baseball, but like how we attach the wires to the end pipes. It's like we trialed some things here, and so that way we can kind of do what I always tell people to do, which is try and innovate and match the vineyard to the vineyard site.
And then when it came time to actually plant, how did you choose what you wanted to plant here?
And that's the very embarrassing thing about, like, it's hard to be decisive. So our very last planting, I was just very much fretting, and we planted 3 rows, and it was originally going to be like a clonal block as an homage to the first wine I ever made, which is from 2005, from a clonal block at Woodhall. And then I realized, man, I'm going to be making that in my garage forever because it'll be 3 rows on the end. And so then I'm like, well, let me try Pinot Blanc. So then I tried all my clients' Pinot Blancs, which were delicious. And then I was like, oh man, I don't want a late ripening thing right next to the trees. And it was like, this is very unlike me to waffle. And so then I'm like, crud. So I had done like a tasting with all my RP colleagues to find the best Pinot Blanc. And so then I finally punted, and we're adding a new Chardonnay clone. And saw some really interesting stuff from the nursery and a lot of research. So we'll have 3 rows of Robert Young Chardonnay. But that was kind of the last waffling. And we have another clone, one of the Mount Eden clones of Chardonnay, because Ryan Collins had planted some of that at Jacob Hart, and he said it yielded well and it was high quality, and it was that good combination. So that sounded like exactly what I was hoping for. And the opposite of that would be, there's a lot of clones that are high quality and low yielding, and we really need to make it work financially. And so the other Chardonnays are 76 and 95, very common, perhaps too common. And so now we'll have 4 kind of colors to play with. And then with the Pinot Noir, Pommard, which is just a stalwart, and then 777, which is a fairly early ripening Dijon clone. And so all of that, fast to explain, but all involved some hand-wringing, and it was like, oh my gosh, what should we do? So.
It's hard when it's your own decision, right? It's hard. It is hard. I get
Yeah,
it.
but it was fun to be able to like talk to winemakers I've been working with. Brian Weil, Joe Dobbs chimed in on these things, and my colleagues at RP to say, hey, what should I do here? So.
You talked about Chardonnay earlier, and now you're planting it here. Obviously, you mentioned it's kind of having its moment now in the Willamette Valley. Tell me, from your perspective, as someone who is planting and maintaining vineyards, how have you seen the growth, and what excites you about Willamette Valley Chardonnay?
I got a lot more excited about Chardonnay after visiting Burgundy, and the first time, and then the second time, it's like, oh my gosh, this is what the goal is. And that was really paradigm changing for me, because it's like, oh my gosh, this is just a new level of the goal. Mm-hmm. And trying some wines like, Walter Scott, Ex Novo Vineyard, and Flaneur, and some of these amazing Adelsheims, I think it's Caitlin's Reserve, just amazing Chardonnays that are really killer. And it's like, okay, that's the goal. And they can sell for a price that will translate to good prices for the grower. And okay, now I get it. So this is, generation 2 of Oregon Chardonnay. And I think it's delicious It's one of the grape varietals of Burgundy. The price point's there, and I think Oregon has a unique story to tell with Chardonnay, and I think the people here that want to do it want to hit home runs with Chardonnay, and that's something we want to be a part of. So to me, that's very exciting. But it's also a versatile variety where you can have a crisp, clean Chardonnay that's stainless steel that gives you everything that Pinot Gris does, but I've had a lot of stainless steel Chardonnays that are great and different and have varietal character, and Pinot Gris has less of that, in my opinion.
So with the actual Bellingar Estate wine, obviously, Kim kind of walked through a bit of the beginning, but I'm curious from your perspective, initial goals for the brand, and then how, and then pivoting when maybe initial goals turn out to be a little bit harder than you anticipated.
Yeah. John Hershey, one of my former clients, asked me how it was going. I was like, well, I'm finding the wine business to be humbling. And he laughed because he knew that I needed some of that. But it's very fun to have a project that's our own. But when I started, very embarrassingly, I started with the smallest amount of wine I could conceive of, thinking that the smallest amount of wine that's a going thing. And I was like, 500 cases, because I'm used to, loading up a truck with 8 tons, and that's just the first truck of the day, right? And so when we had 500 cases, and I was working full-time, Kim was working full-time, and the goal was, hey, a $20 Pinot that'll fly through grocery store shelves, easy peasy. And then they didn't, because nobody was out there working it, and it's an entirely different world of distribution, that it took a few years to realize, oh, this isn't working. And then luckily we had this property kind of at the time, and pivoted, decreased production to right size with sales, and now we're I think we're at 250 cases this year, and we may want to grow from there. But when I started, I wanted to be big. I all these folks we work with and I look up to, it's like I want to be playing with those guys. But now I would much rather be viable or solvent, right? And so I'm okay being. My goal for Bellingar Estates is to be self-sustaining and not requiring more capital, but be able to bring great wines to people that come and visit without. I no longer need to be huge and be nationally distributed, and that's the opposite of what I would have said a few years ago.
What is the plan with the grapes here? Is the plan just to be an estate winery, or is the plan to make wines from elsewhere and sell these grapes, or what is kind of your plan going forward with the vineyard? Yeah, with the 2020 vintage, we now have some estate wines, so we're super excited about that. Some Pinot Noir and Chardonnay came our way to be made into wine with our friends at Dobbs, and we also sold some of the grapes. So some of them got sold to Olaxana, our great friends over there, and then some to Scott Kelly down in Roseburg. And I'm really excited about that. These are people I've worked with for many years, and it's fun to be able to send them wine that I grew. And I want to do that as long as I can, and for the brand, I don't want to be estate driven, because there's just so many cool vineyards out there, and I've worked with a lot of these vineyards. And our Reserve Pinot is a blend of now the Stark Vineyard and Terry, and I planted both of those, and I farmed those still. And so to me, that's an interesting part of the story, and something this site could never do, because we're not covered in basalt cobbles like Terry, and we're not this beautiful exposure on Parrot Mountain as Stark. And so to me, I would rather have a more exciting, fun wine than just something I grew, because I'm just the grape guy. Our South Pass Syrah, grown by our buddy Travis, crazy vineyard site over in the Snake River around Baker County, and 3,400 feet of elevation. The wine's amazing, and it's got it's sagebrush, and it's bright, and it's just really unique and distinct. And if I was an estate model, I would never be able to tell that story and have that collaboration. Travis Cook, I assume.
Travis Cook.
Travis Cook. Those are amazing grapes he's got out there. You mentioned that you've been making garage wine a long time. Do you have any intention of making your own wine commercially?
My joke used to be that I made garage wine or garage yeast wine long enough to know that I really need to hire a winemaker. And I don't want to be the winemaker. I don't have the personality for it. I want to get to 90% and stop, or 95% and stop and go on to the next task. And in agriculture, that's essential. A perfectionist in agriculture would die. Like, it's just, you can never be perfect in ag because something's always growing, or something like, or cows get loose in your dang vineyard or something like that. But in wine, a perfectionist is great because they're looking to take it from 99% to 100%. And so I've realized I'm not the personality for winemaking, and so let's hire the best people we can and work with great people, and let's grow some great grapes.
So you talked about your kind of goals for here of thinking large and now kind of changing that and being viable. Tell me about what you see.
And by viable, I mean not going broke.
Not going broke.
As long as we don't get foreclosed, that's a goal.
Tell me what you foresee for Bellingar over the next 5 or 10 years. What's kind of your hope for the site and for the brand?
We want to double down on direct to consumer. We want people to come here and to be able to have an amazing experience, and we don't want to become like a I forget what the word is, but in the fall when you go pick up pumpkins, like a pumpkin patch kind of thing. We don't want to be a pumpkin patch, but what does a pumpkin patch do? It brings people from the city out into the country. They're connecting with a farm and a piece of land, and they're making a memory. And that's what we want to do. So we want people to be able to come here, hear our story, enjoy some delicious wines, and make a memory and connect with a piece of land. My uncle visited Sokolblosser in like 1988 or something like that. That photo he took of his son is still on his desk, and he remembers it like it was yesterday. And we have that capacity to build memories for new folks, to be able to come have a great experience, sit by the fire and look out over the Chehalem Mountains behind us, drink a glass of wine, and just have a great conversation with somebody you're next to. Hopefully we're going to be picking apples and things like that. And I think as a society we're losing that, and we want to create that connection.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked a bit about 2020 already, but I'm curious from your perspective. Obviously 2020 is a real fun topic to talk about right now, but let's talk about the pandemic first and its effects. Obviously in the viticulture industry had a pretty big impact. Tell me about your recollections of it and the adjustments you had to make to kind of make it through the viticulture part of the year.
In a way, it happened at the first wave, so to speak, kind of like mid-March, where everybody realized, oh my gosh, this is a big one, right? It happened at a good time for us viticulturally because it was kind of that lull after pruning, but before shoot thinning and everything got rolling. And it was so interesting. It was a big global disaster happening in real time that was affecting everybody's personal life, everybody's business. But the grapes still need to get shoot thinned. They still need to be dealt with. Mm-hmm. And I was talking with my guys and early on, and I was like, because I like the big idea, I like the vision, like, hey, we're going to get to the other side of this kind of thing. But it's like, this was, at the time, more like driving in the fog. And when you're driving in the fog, you can't see where you're going, but you can see a little bit farther ahead. So then you drive there, and then you can see a little bit farther ahead. And that was what we were doing in March and April and forward. And then like more regulations came out and like guidance and things like that. Mm-hmm. Okay, social distancing out in the vineyard, masks in the vineyard, like what happens when somebody gets sick, what happens when somebody gets test positive for COVID, contact tracing within the company and things like that. And now, a year later, we know what to do, but it was the not knowing and the dramatic nature of it that was so earth-shaking. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to back up a little bit here. I'm curious about, you had this sort of notion of wine and grapes growing up and its interest in it. As you became more aware of Oregon wine industry, do you remember like your first impressions of the industry, what your kind of the first experiences were like?
I think I had the impression before joining it that it was small and collegial and had that reputation, and I have very much found that to be true. That the Grape Days and then Oregon Wine Symposium, it's a fairly small organization. You know, now it's I don't know, 2,500 people or 1,500 people, something like that. That's just so much smaller than the comparable thing in California, and people are collaborative, and you can call winemakers up and say, hey, I've got this thing, and what should I plant? What kind of Chardonnay should I plant? Because I'm dithering over here. And people are typically very nice and very helpful. So it's matched expectations in that way. It very collegial, very, for the most part, kind. Yeah.
What's changed in the industry since you've become a part of it?
There's been more waves of kind of California and international interest, and every time there is one of those, there's that fear that, like, oh my gosh, this is kind of the end of Oregon, and that hasn't happened yet. Every time somebody has come in, it's generally been additive, which is very nice. There's more. It seems to be more of like an economic cluster, so to speak. Like there's now more. The Allison, for example, was huge for the local lodging, Red Hills Market, and it's like there's this culture in the wine business of folks that are in the wine business that want excellent food, they want excellent lodging, and the people that come here for tourism, and so that's grown, and I think that's a good thing.
And what about for the future? What do you see Oregon wine looking like coming out of the pandemic, and then for the next 5 or 10 years?
I think the growth generally, I think we're going to see more of the same and faster. And you know, how many times have you heard somebody say this just feels like Napa in 1975? And I think we're moving along a trajectory towards that. And I want to keep our Oregon roots and our Oregon spirit, but Oregon's too good of a place to keep a secret, right? And that's never going to happen. So how do we grow? How do we welcome more visitors sustainably and kind of tell our story? So I think we're going to see more of what we've seen, and that's a good thing. You hear a lot of times people say, "Oh, there's too many wine brands," and I feel responsible for that, at least in my small way. But it's up to everybody to tell the Oregon story, and I think that's a good thing, that we've got more and more people out there beating the pavement across the world to tell our story, and that's a good thing.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to join the Oregon wine industry in some capacity?
I would very much encourage them. I think it's so much easier to get a job and to grow in something that's growing, and as I mentioned, it's so diverse. There's so much space for folks. I think it's wonderful. I would just tell them to keep their ears open and be nice to interns, because Kim and I, we used to rent rooms out of our house to people like wine interns, and it was always a great experience. We always got to meet somebody from across the world in a lot of cases, and some of those people have gone on to do great things. So yeah, generally should be nice to everybody, but particularly be nice to interns, because they're going to be the rock star winemakers of the next generation.
Last question for you, and it's one I kind of passed over earlier, but I'm sort of curious about it now. You obviously, you're full time with Results Partners. It's quite a job. Tell me about your role here, and sort of what you want to be able to give to Bellingar Estate as it grows.
Chief Bullshit Officer. I don't know. Yeah, it's fun because it's fun to start something and launch something, and to me, I don't have to be here in the tasting room telling the story to get that enjoyment. The fact that Kim's doing an amazing job with that, or hopefully one day we'll be able to hire somebody, that's okay. It doesn't have to be me. And I very much enjoy what I do. I enjoy planting new vineyards and discovering what it can do and being part of the broader industry. And so I like that broad nature. And then at Bellingar Estates, it's narrow in terms of what the site and our wines and things like that. But it's been educational for me to see that side of things. And I think it lends an extra nuance in speaking with clients, because then it's like, okay, it's easy for us to say, we'll plant 60 acres and then we'll see how it goes. And I think it's an added bonus to know a little bit about how wine sells or doesn't sell in our case. So.
Now you have a model vineyard to come show off to potential clients.
Yeah, hopefully. That we love, and yeah, it's nice.
All the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here today that we should have covered?
One thing I wanted to mention, totally didn't come up with anything, but Kim was getting her MBA, and she wanted to go travel abroad for that, because she always regretted not traveling abroad during her undergrad. And so she was like, and PSU had something to go to the Middle East, and she was like, that's crazy. I would never go to the Middle East if it wasn't as part of this bigger trip. And so I was able to like basically audit the class somehow. And so we spent like a week in Kuwait and a week in Qatar. And it was so interesting because coming from the Western background, like wine in a lot of families is a part of daily activity. It's a part of religious ceremonies. It's just it's so integral to what we're doing. But in Middle Eastern countries, it is entirely not. And like Kuwait was like dry, not a speck of wine anywhere. And in Qatar, you could get it at some like Western, like the W Hotel in Doha had like 2 different types of wine. And so at the end of like a very fun, very cool, very educational trip, I was very thirsty for some wine. And so I had a glass of, it was like a provincial rosé at the W Hotel in Doha after like 2 weeks of like no alcohol. And that was like, for some unheard of amount of money, and that was like the best glass of wine I've ever had, because it was like cool and crisp and in this amazing different country. And it was just probably my favorite glass of wine ever.
I love it.
That story has nothing to do with anything.
That's great. That's the whole point of the whole point of the interview, right? Appreciate your time today. Appreciate your hospitality, making sure we set this interview up and getting us out here. And thank you so much. I'll let you off the hook.
Thank you.